Welcome to another Cafecito conversation. And I'm just delighted to be with a dear friend and colleague. We're sharing a little virtual coffee together. I'm with Angela Robles. And Angela, could you introduce yourself and what you do at APU?
Sure. Well, thank you. Well, you both, you and Mika, are two of my favorite people at APU. So this is just a treat for today for sure. But yeah, my name is Angela Robles. And so I teach, I'm an associate professor in graduate physical education. I also serve as the curriculum specialist for our sport management emphasis, where we have some leadership students, some MBA and BM students, so it kind of crosses over to other areas. But that has been just a joy. I actually taught at APU for 15 years before moving on to full time. So I think if I did my math right, this is like my 21st or 22nd year connected to APU. But yeah, and I'm only 25, so that's pretty, no, I'm just kidding.
Wow,
Yeah, so it's been
I
a
believe
journey.
you.
It's been a journey, but no, I actually started teaching when I was doing my doctorate at APU in our higher ed program. So it's just been such a privilege to stay connected to the university and then now full circle teach in the program that I earned my master's in back in 2001. So that's the role I serve. I also will say too, all of my teaching is in the graduate area, and it's about 95% online. So that's kind of the lens I look at in terms of even in our conversations and student work. It's a lot of online and grad.
Well, thank you for your dedication to Azusa Pacific. Thank you for spending time with us today. And this is a cafecito, our virtual coffee house. And a cafecito is a little coffee. In Spanish, it's a little coffee, but a cafecito means time to talk. And, so we have virtual coffee poured. We have our time together in our virtual coffee house. And today, Angela, I wanted to talk to you about ambassadors because you are one of our stellar diversity ambassadors. And so, just to open up our conversation about ambassadors today, is that how did you experience the ambassador work? And let's start with that. If you were to talk to somebody who said, "Hey, Angela, I'm thinking about attending diversity ambassadors," what would you tell them?
Yeah, sure. Well, I would say so. A little bit of background too for me is a lot of my life as a student, as an athlete, and even professionally has been in the world of sports. So I've always been super passionate about being part of a team. So I think what drew me even initially to diversity ambassadors is it was another opportunity to be part of a team. So I really enjoyed that. I think for me, my background and my life in sports, traveling, playing internationally. I've had a chance to play in Italy and Mexico and Venezuela. And so I've always been really curious about other cultures, curious about how teams become cohesive. And I think that translates for us as faculty. So my role as faculty, how do I create a really cohesive, inclusive classroom? And specifically doing that online is often challenging. So I think I had a desire to deepen my understanding of what that can look like. How do I create culturally hospitable environments? How do you do that online in an asynchronous setting, right? So I really had a hunger, I think, for just learning more. And I think too, just the draw of being able to be with like-minded people who also valued the idea of not just seeing and embracing diversity, but also the action moving into how do we create these inclusive spaces. That's kind of the initial desire to jump in and be part of it.
Beautiful. Well, one of our pioneers in diversity at APU was Dr. Kim Denew, and she talked a lot about local impact and global impact. She even coined a term "glocal."
Oh, wow.
And so you've had really a big picture view of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you mentioned as an educator, you've seen a bigger picture. As an athlete in sports, you've seen a bigger picture, especially in athletic circles around the world. So how do we make that bridge? I guess that's my question to you, Angela, is that there are students, as an example,
Yeah.
at APU that may not have that local perspective. So how can diversity be a bridge not only to other cultures, but actually a bridge to that knowledge?
Yeah. And so I think, so one of the things, again, that I feel like I really gained from being the diversity ambassador training, but also just some of the curiosity on my end, trying to develop, grab onto resources that were available. I had a chance to do an online, I think it was through Harvard. It was just a 1 week certificate about um, culturally inclusive literature. So what does that mean? How do we bring in literature into our classroom that comes from a cultural standpoint? And there was a really interesting TED talk by a woman named Grace Lynn, and she talked about this concept of windows and mirrors. And so I think I took that even into diversity ambassador, and I thought, how do I teach? How do I teach online and provide opportunities for our students to be able to have both windows and mirrors? So how do they see and learn experiences outside of their own, but especially for our diverse students, our minority students, our female students in sport, things like that, are they seeing themselves in our literature? So being able to look at our syllabus, being able to look at the resources that we're putting online and the videos, I think that for me has been probably on the forefront in terms of teaching, is just trying to be really mindful about the experience for our students, particularly online. Are they seeing enough of others' experiences, but also are they seeing a reflection of their own? So that's one of the things I've been trying to learn more and be more curious about, for
Oh,
sure.
that's beautiful. Okay, so windows and mirrors. So,
Yeah.
okay, so for you personally and professionally, what were some of the mirrors that assisted you in your reflection of your own walk as an educator or as an individual that you found helpful in the diversity ambassador experience?
Yeah, so I think just that like-mindedness of being curious, right? So I don't know if anybody ever watches Ted Lasso. It's kind of in the sport world, but he has this great line as a coach about being curious. The more curious you are about people, the more curious you are about others, you have an opportunity to find that there are things in others that you did not know were there, that you're able to find that connection with. So I think for me, it was being able to be part of an environment that um, it was comfortable to be vulnerable and ask the hard questions. I felt very not alone, I guess I could say. So I think that was a mirror for me, is seeing other faculty or staff as part of this team, this group, to say, oh, they have the same question. They were
Yes.
struggling with this as well, or they have that same desire and interest and passion in creating environments that are authentic and genuine and inclusive. So I think the mirror for me was seeing, it was really affirming to see that there were other faculty and staff who shared that same desire. So I felt very, yeah, I don't know that that's a very scholarly way of saying it, but I felt very not alone. It was a
Right.
wonderful way to see that like-mindedness in other APU colleagues.
That's beautiful, because sometimes in our society now, when the word diversity comes up,
Mhm.
it seems to, for some, bring up division.
Right.
Oh, well, you're talking about diversity. You're talking about all these different cultures. Well, aren't you dividing people instead
Right.
of uniting them? And what you said about not feeling alone is so important, because sometimes with difficult conversations, it can be isolating initially. But
Yeah.
once again, how do we bridge and create environments in which we can have difficult conversations, but also celebratory ones as well?
Right.
And so, as you think about Azusa Pacific right now, we're in a lot of transitions. So give the listeners or viewers a little context if they get this out of context for our video and podcast. Is right now Azusa Pacific in January 2022 is looking for a new president. So we have a presidential search going on. We are in the midst of what we call a renewal strategic planning process, which we started, it's really started over a couple years ago, but now we're starting to gain traction, yet we're preparing for a new president to now take the reins to move it forward. So there are a lot of things kind of like pieces in motion, Angela, that at least that I'm feeling. So kind of rewinding my long prep for my question here is this, is that we're in preparation for renewal at Azusa Pacific. But sometimes in all that preparation, we can feel isolated, back to what you said earlier. And sometimes diversity, equity, and inclusion cannot be the cause of isolation, but sometimes it can be forgotten in all the plans. So how might we use diversity, equity, and inclusion to be a glue, to build that community in which we can have difficult conversations, but yet celebrate the diversity that has grown at Azusa Pacific University? So in this transition we're in, just to rephrase my question, in the transition that we're in, how can we use diversity, equity, and inclusion as that, you know, that secret sauce, if you will, that can really move us forward in a very positive way as we rebuild our culture?
Yeah. Well, I always say, and I think I shared this with you before we even started, I feel so inadequate to speak into this for sure. So I would just share from my own kind of personal like learning experience. The first thing that I think of is a conversation, you know, I had, and I'll try not to get emotional, a conversation I had with my husband who, you know, he's Hispanic. His parents are from Mexico. English was not his first language. And so for him, you know, he attended APU back in the 90s, and it was definitely not an HSI, right? Like he was one of few, and he would, you know, and he had a great experience. But I think for him, when I think about some of the things that we've talked about together and how we think about even raising our children who are, you know, half Latina, right? Like they have a big part of their culture that they're embracing. And so I think of sending them to APU as undergrads, or, you know, the direction that we're heading in. And one of the things that we have talked about a lot as we think about, you know, just serving at APU for me in a faculty context and sort of where we're going. And I'll give credit to him for saying this, but he mentioned the importance of not looking at diversity as a topic, but as a value. And so I think for me, that's probably where I find that I'm kind of pausing and really trying to reflect and say, okay, if we look at where we're headed, for me as an educator, as a faculty, you know, working with my students, sport management students, or teaching online, how do I approach my personal role at APU and embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just as a topical thing we talk about, but really looking at it as a value, just as we do faith integration, right? It applies to every class we teach. It applies to every syllabus, you know, we make. So how do we do that in a really effective and genuine way? So I think that for me, my long answer is, I think collectively, my hope is that we start to look at it as a shared value and not just how it fits, right? And certain things that we're doing.
That's spot on, Angela. And that resonates for me, and I get excited about that, because when we talk about not just a topic, but a value, we're talking about walking the talk.
Right.
We're talking about, in this case, Azusa Pacific, but any organization that espouses to embrace diversity.
Yeah.
It's really what people feel when they're on campus, what they experience on campus, how it is played out in actuality.
Yeah.
And so you're a bridge builder, and you then cultivate that type of environment within your classes. So as you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a value, how have you embedded that value in your coursework?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and one thing I think too, you and I have talked about prior is even just the value. This is a simple, practical thing I think that I'm doing in my classes, but also my hope would be university-wide, where we kind of consider this, but the importance of names, right? So you and I have talked before about how important it is, the name that we've been given, first name, last name, our heritage, what that looks like. And so I've been reflecting on that a lot lately. And I think one of the practical things I've done as faculty is to be able, even in my signature line, to put the pronunciation of my name, right? So One for me, I mean, if somebody misses my name, I don't mind, right? But I think I'm hoping a small step that as I interact with a student, even via email, it opens the door for them to also say, oh, this is how you pronounce my name, right? So I've been called Robles many, many times, which is fine, right? But it's Angela Robles, for me, I didn't even know that until my husband and I were dating for a while. And he goes, you should probably get this right. But I think about our students, and I think about especially our international students, some of our students of color, Hispanic students, those who have maybe not just the Joe Smith name, right? Like, how do we honor the fact of the importance and the value of calling our students by their right pronunciation with their name? I just think it's so important. And if I could say truly, I think that even applies all the way through graduation. It's one of the most important things that a student will experience in APU. It's that celebratory moment. And I've seen many times, many universities, but also at APU, where we just miss it. We miss an opportunity to honor the last name of one of our students that for their family, it's their first public, you know, affirmation of the work that they've done. We have to get that right.
We
We
do
have
have to get that right.
we do.
Right when you said that, when I went from visualizing when it said correctly, just
Mhm.
this elation.
Yeah.
Then when it said incorrectly, it's like a letdown. It's kind of like,
Yeah.
oh no, they said Martinez instead of
Yeah.
Martinez.
And again, I'm probably gonna, I want to watch my words here, but probably the boldness in me comes from learning about my husband's background, right? And so knowing even if we are an HSI institution, it's critical that for our Hispanic students, but all students, we have to get it right, even in that moment. Because for a lot of our extended families of our students, this is their first touch point with APU, right? So how do we honor that in our classes, but all the way through even to that moment of graduation. And so I think, again, just a small thing on names, but it was interesting yesterday. I was reading an article about the WNBA. So I'll tie it back into sports, right? But the WNBA has around 150 or less female athletes. And it's so interesting. There's a lot of conversation right now about this importance of names and how a lot of the broadcasters have continually over the years mispronounced a lot of the players' names. And you think 150 athletes, we've got to get that right. And so, yeah, we have a dear friend who their daughter's playing in the WNBA, and she's a rookie, and she's so excited. But continually, instead of Dijonay, the announcers are calling her Dijon, and she publicly tweeted about it and had conversations. And I thought, what a missed opportunity for a team or an organization to say, this is something simple that we can do to get right, honors the student, honors the athlete, honors the team that they play for, so forth. But anyway, so that's just a parallel to what's happening kind of in the sporting world. But this idea of names and valuing, I think it's a practical thing we can do, even in our classes, but at APU that moves us forward to living out this value that we collectively have.
So embedded in that reflection is a sense of urgency. You said a couple times, we need to get this right. We need to get this right. And I'll echo it one more time. We need to get this right.
Yeah.
No matter if it was a designation like Hispanic Serving Institution,
right.
HSI, we need to get this right for all students and for our students of color.
Yeah.
So there is a sense of urgency here. So I'm prayerful that at Azusa Pacific University, there is more of an urgency, at least to have this awareness being raised. Now it's been raising gradually, and I think it's been raised within our strategic planning groups as well. I've talked to different people who've been part of the process, and they have assured me, and I've seen it within groups I've been part of, that there is more of an awareness for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But we still have to have the urgency. So looking at our organization now, and maybe this is not just an APU question, but an organizational university higher ed question. So let's put on our thinking caps a moment. Is that how might we raise the urgency
Mm.
of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it's not just a title, it's not just a program, it is a value. So how do we raise the urgency and the awareness at APU and in higher education?
Gosh, that's a tough question. You know, my sport was softball. That was not a softball question. Oh my
No,
gosh.
that was a fastball.
Yes, that was like a rise ball, curveball, you know, and again, I'm always so hesitant to speak beyond, you know, my scope or my experience. So you know, I think that is a really difficult question. I think it's an important question. I think the first thing that came to mind as you were asking was just simply we have to listen. We really have to listen to the needs of our students. And we actually have to know who our students are, right? So one of the things that, again, practical step that for me, I want to continue to do, but even reaching out to the graduate registrar and being able to say, like, can you pull for me demographics of what our students look like in this particular department or in this program? Because I just am curious about, like, what are the demographics of our students? We see them online, or we, you know, but really, who are our students? Where do they come from? What is their background? How do we honor that? And then also, how do we listen? So what their needs are. So I remember, gosh, this was so hard. I remember in summer 2020, I was teaching sociology and ethics of sport. And the week that we were covering racial ideology was the week that we had the George Floyd
Oh,
murder. And and I thought, I am not equipped. I am not equipped. And so I remember just opening up a Zoom, kind of like, hey, let's just pop in if people want to talk. And it was just this idea of being able to be vulnerable, but also creating space and listening and saying, what can we do as a community to come around? Because I don't think we can be blind to what's happening in our culture, in our country. This applies also to our students who are LGBTQ. This applies to
right.
our students who are, you know, gender minorities and stronger, you know, single gender, you know,
Yes.
fields, you know, all of these things. And so, but I think listening to what our students need, and then also being aware of what's happening in the world around us, and being willing to create space to listen. And I think providing our students an opportunity to say, this is when I feel most heard. This is what you or the university or AP or whatever have done that have made me feel most valued. How do we not, I don't think we should guess, right? We need to invite the input in, and we need to listen to our students to be able to say, like, okay, what's working and where are we missing it?
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah,
So at first, you know, we were both saying, oh, this is a real difficult question.
yeah,
And there are complexities to it.
right.
However, at the very core of this is something that can be quite simple,
Mm,
is listening to each other, creating a space, and honoring what we hear.
mhm,
You
right,
know,
right.
honoring those that are part of that space and that conversation.
And I
And
think and I think bringing that information back to our programs and our colleagues who maybe feel incredibly uncomfortable about stepping into that space, right? And that's where I think the Diversity Ambassador program was so helpful, because we can have those hard conversations, but also learn from what others are doing that's working or that's not working, and then going back to our, you know, our teams, our departments or our colleagues, and be able to say, like, hey, this is what they're doing in social work. This is what they're doing in business. Gosh, in music, they had this great idea. Let's do that together, you know? And so I think not reinventing the wheel, but getting out of our silos, and as a greater community, having those conversations and being willing to bring ideas from other parts of APU back into our own kind of more our smaller teams, to be able to share what we have been hearing, right?
oh, that's
Because
exciting.
what we're hearing shouldn't just be for those who are, you know, at the door listening. We should be the conduits that take that back, you know, to our own individual teams, for sure.
So there's an excitement. There is this joy that can be released through those types of interchanges and reflections, and it brings people together. And even if, like you mentioned during the George Floyd tragedy, and you opened up your online course to the dialogue
Mhm.
and being brave enough to do so.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think the only way, even in that moment, that I felt comfortable in doing that is that it was comfortable to also be vulnerable and not be the expert. And I think that's what, even like the hesitation for me having this call, I thought, I'm not an expert, I can't, but if we're just willing to, I think, step into the uncomfortable and kind of share our experiences, I think with our students, even in those hard conversations, sometimes the willingness also opens that door too. I think that, so I was going to say too, even if there are faculty and staff who are hesitant for diversity ambassador program because they think, well, I'm not an expert, it really comes down to, are you curious? Are you curious about, who our students are and how we serve them well? Are you willing just to like listen and learn, but also are you interested in being part of that difference, right? So it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay not to know all the answers, but just to be part of that larger collective that said, we're here and we're willing to learn more. And we just want to be part of a greater team, right? That is willing to do this together.
Oh. So let's play around with that a little bit.
Okay.
I'm thinking about that curiosity. Okay, so I'm trying to weigh my question now. So
Okay.
I'm thinking about that excitement and the curiosity that is part of this experience and being able to share within, say, this safe environment that we created, even in our virtual Cafecito coffee
Right.
house,
Right.
right? You
Right.
know, so, but where I'm going with this is that there's still some difficult issues to unpack, and
Mhm.
you were dealing with that vulnerability
Yeah.
in your class, and so you have in your own personal life, you mentioned being a Robles
Mhm.
and seeing and experiencing a Latino culture. In your sports life, you've experienced different, possibly even prejudices. You mentioned the WNBA, and
Right.
then your um, experience as a woman in sports.
Mhm.
Um, so, how do you communicate some of those difficult life experiences within, say, and I'll say it's within a safe environment. I'll just make that an assumption right now. But still, it's hard to share.
Sure.
How does one get to that point of being able to share all those heartfelt experiences enabled in order for others to maybe experience it a little bit or be able to see your perspective?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think um, just as much as there is a value in sharing the stories that have worked, right? The storytelling of like, this was such a beautiful experience, and this is a scenario that happened, and there was such a redeeming moment here, and this life-changing moment. I think it's equally important in a safe space, and I think we saw this in the diversity ambassador program, to create a space to also with trust there, be able to be vulnerable and said, man, this was tough and I did not handle it well, right?
Ah,
So, I mean, I think too, being able to say like, I didn't know how to answer, I didn't know how to address that situation, so I just kind of didn't touch it. And I feel like it was detrimental to our students, right? Or I feel like I said this and I regret saying it, I didn't say it well. I think in those moments, I think it's when we have that safe space created, whether it's in our department, if we feel like there's trust to do that, whether it's in the diversity ambassador program, but the storytelling of both scenarios, I think, is really important. So it helps to hear others share, this is what happened, and it wasn't this beautiful bow tie experience, but like this was really hard. And I did not feel like I handled that well, or I wish I would have said this better, or I wish I would have held the terminology. I think that creates a more genuine, authentic place for us to be really vulnerable and say, okay, I also would have really not known how to respond there. So how do we then, again, not feel alone, but to be able to say like, let's look at that scenario then that didn't work, or where we felt like we could have done it different, and let's think through like some options of like what we could have done or what we should have said, and to be able to move forward with some kind of plan or strategy for when that happens again. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's
Oh,
almost
yeah.
like as an athlete, right? Like you have to watch game film of when things
Yes.
worked really well, but you also have to see game film of times that you think like, I don't know if I did that right. I don't know if I said that right. I don't know if this caused growth, or if this maybe caused frustration. So how do I do that more effectively
Wow.
the next time it happens?
And,
Richard, this is so hard. My strengths of empathy include, I get so emotional. I'm so sorry.
no, this is beautiful,
Yeah.
Angela, and we're just
Mm.
blessed that you're sharing this with us,
Wow.
um, because this is conversations like this, and I'll go back to my little coffee there. Uh, Frankly, we need to take the time.
Mm,
We need to take the time with each other, and how often do we do that? That's the rhetorical question here.
right.
We kind of rewinding a little bit in our conversation, we mentioned, and you mentioned, the importance of listening, the importance of valuing. You just were mentioning the importance of the story.
Mm, mm-hmm.
Uh, Whether that story is that bow tie experience, or whether the story has a lot of tears and anguish that go along with it. Um, but to be able to share takes some time.
Right.
And I I don't want to oversimplify this, but we could probably count on our hands the number of times a week. I'll just say a week,
Mm-hmm.
that we really have a sit down conversation like this with somebody.
Mm,
Um, and I need to self-convict myself. In our sessions, I
yeah.
probably mentioned this a lot. When you point to others, or three fingers
Yep.
pointing back. you
Yeah.
know,
Right.
and I have to really sit down with you and think, I really haven't had that type of conversation
Mm,
intentionally on a consistent life experience, making it part of what we do or what I do. But we really get to a different level when we do.
right.
And so thank you for sharing, and thank you
Mhm.
for being part of that experience with us today. And wow, Angela, you're a wealth of information. And
Mm,
and and when you were saying that you feel ill-equipped, but look at the
100%.
depth of your reflections. I'm just so blessed to be a part of
Mm,
what you've brought to our uh, Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Inclusive Excellence, what you brought to our diversity ambassadors. And offline, before we started recording, I was saying that both Meek and I are so inspired by you, with the emails you'll send. This is what I've tried in the class, and this is what I'm doing. And so I'm going to shift gears a little bit to your putting on your professor hat now, as we
okay.
think about kind of the applications,
Mm,
because you've inspired us, frankly.
gosh.
And so if you were then having this conversation with a fellow faculty member, whatever course they're teaching, what might you say to them? Maybe things you've done. You mentioned names, and knowing names as being so important, about just pronunciation of the names. But
Mhm.
are there some other things that, if you're
Mm.
having a little coffee with a faculty member in your field or not in your field, are there some things that you would say, hey, you might want to consider this or that?
Oh, gosh, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for your kind words because I couldn't say enough about what you do, and Mika and Dr. Keith Hall. I just feel APU would be so at a loss without what you're doing, and just yeah, your collaboration and your friendship. I'm so grateful. So I think if I was just having coffee with a colleague and we were talking about some things that we're working, or some things that we've tried. The names is a really easy, kind of first step. I think I always go, I'll tie into sports again, but Lou Holtz was a football coach at Notre Dame for, years and years. And his last 2 years coaching was my first two as an athlete in the 90s. And I remember he talked about, I'll get to the point, but I remember he talked about, coaching a football squad of, almost 100 players. How do you get buy-in? How do you create strong, cohesive teams? And so I remember him speaking at a pep rally, and he talked about, players need three things, right? They need to be known, valued, and cared for. And I think as a freshman athlete at Notre Dame, I remember hearing that, and I thought that actually has carried kind of as a value for me throughout my entire journey in teaching. So I think if I was talking to someone today, I would say I try, even from a diversity, equity, inclusion perspective, to say, how am I actively trying to know my students? And that's, I think, where the name comes in, the pronunciation, their family, their heritage, their skills, their strengths. But also, how do I demonstrate that I value them? I value the work they do. I value their efforts. So I think in that terms, I think even in the graduate program that I'm teaching in, some of our multilingual students really have struggled with academic writing, because they're translating and writing and code switching. And so I remember thinking, what can I actively do if I have one of my students who I just, see their efforts and I think, God, they're really struggling with this paper. Well, how do I reach out to the writing center and make sure I actively find a writing coach who is bilingual, to say, can I connect the gap so that they're able to be able to have the resources they have, even in an online setting, right? So for me, that's sort of one step in terms of value. If I value their work, I value their efforts, can I support them in that way? And then the third piece, I think, the caring for our students, that's where we talk about the emotional, spiritual, physical health. And I think especially in our Department of Kinesiology and in sport management, mental health is such a huge thing that we're looking at and talking about. So how am I actively looking at supporting, caring for my students? How do you demonstrate caring for an online asynchronous student, right? So I think there are things that we can do in that even online space to demonstrate empathy, to demonstrate caring for them. And maybe that means, being able to respond to an email on a Sunday night, or opening up an optional office hour, in an evening where a working student online has access to us, And so I think regardless of where our students are coming from, this idea of being known, valued, and cared for, I think, is incredibly important. So I've tried to find things in those three categories to say, how can I actively, and how can I learn from others and actively try to move forward in those three kind of approaches with my students.
Wow. Known, valued, cared for. I think we're going to have to recruit you for a special session.
No. And then I'll put a "Go Irish" at the end for my name. Yeah. But
well, so that brings to mind something that we don't often collectively talk about enough within education, is the mentorship part.
Yeah.
And I really sense that known, valued, cared for framework has helped you be a mentor. And could you expand on that a little bit? Or you may not have thought of it in terms of mentorship, but we also need to, the big we need to be cultivating those future mentors, if you will.
Right.
And so in your thoughts around mentorship, known, valued, and cared for as a frame, or other thoughts, what might you say to somebody if they came to you and said, you know what, I really need to mentor not only my students more, but maybe new faculty members? What might that look like?
Yeah, gosh, so I think there's a couple different things that come to mind, but so I think what I've learned also in sport and in coaching is that, picture the football team of 100 athletes, right? Or the softball team, or as a coach, it's incredibly hard to mentor each individual athlete. I mean, that's true in our classes too. I feel like that's the risk of burnout. That's the risk of spreading ourselves too thin. I'm really trying to learn the balance as even a mom with two kids. Like, how do I have that family balance, but also love and care for my students and mentor them? So I think one thing that I've been trying to do um, intentionally is possibly be intentional with mentoring maybe my female students that come through who want to look at a doctorate, right? If they're an athletic coach, they want to possibly do a doctorate. That's when I most greatly needed mentorship in my life, and so I'm drawn, to them. So if I have room to maybe individually mentor a student that falls in that pocket, the includer part of me, the strength of the includer and the woo, I think, oh, how do we extend ourselves beyond that? And so one thing that I've really tried to be intentional with is staying highly connected with our alumni, because I think that's a massive opportunity for me. I know if I have if I have a African American or Black student coach who's coaching basketball right now, well, we connect and I can help network. But I think, gosh, I have 5 alumni who are moving in the field, and they're just like, so successful and so engaged. And I think, can I be the connection so that they get deep mentorship with someone who is that mirror for them, where in the field, in their profession, it's a connection that I think has been so valuable. Because I also know where my heart and my desire is, but also how do we extend ourselves to make sure that all students have an opportunity to be mentored. So I think for me, again, I don't know if I'm articulating that well, but I'm really trying to be intentional with our alumni and saying, how do we be the bridge builder so that as students come through, it's not just mentoring to mentor, but it's saying, here's someone with this specific interest, the specific background, and I think they need a mirror. So how do we connect them with someone in the program who has graduated and been successful, that we think that's going to be a really important relationship for them to have? How do we build that bridge for them? And then also, how do we bring our alumni back in and stay connected with us, right? So I think that's one way I think I've been trying to do. The idea of mentorship is just even connecting our students with the mirrors that they need in their profession.
Because mentorship, you really highlighted an important aspect that I think can be overlooked, is networking.
Right.
You have a network of wonderful professionals that you can help others tap into, and you can have those recommendations that then you said can build bridges for a career and for a life.
Yeah. And I think too, if I could say, I think this is true for all of our students, but in particular, our students of color and our minority students, I think we have, when we talk about having to get it right, I think one of the things we have to do too is, if it's a genuine relationship, a genuine knowing, valuing, caring for them, it can't stop at graduation, right? Like, we have to be able to say, not just we value you because you're at APU for this time, but also, I get emotional again, right? But when our students leave, like, it can't be disingenuous to say, we're glad you're here and go, but also to be able to say, like, we valued you then, but we still value you. So how do we, it's just something I'm sitting in right now and trying to really do that intentionally. So
well, and it's part of a life journey, because we go through cycles within a life, and then cycles of life that we experience personally.
Right.
And well, frankly, personally for me, I mean, I'm not at the very end.
Yeah.
but yet I think of life and mentorship in different ways now. Is that who's going to carry on this work is one question I have. And people like yourself give me hope in your creativity, in your connection to people, in being a relationship builder, in your expertise, in your background, many different experiences you've had in life, the excitement you bring to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know you are going to now, not just now, you have been imparting that to others around you and for your students. And that's so powerful. So I'll touch on the alumni part of it now.
Yeah.
We have alumni diversity ambassadors,
Oh, great.
and we have now over 380 strong,
Wow.
some of which have gone on past APU or beyond APU and other different parts of their careers. But I have hope, and I pray that they're planting seeds now of diversity, equity, and inclusion in other locations, of other organizations. So I'd like to pick your brains a bit now, because you're very emotional and you're well spoken about not just the one and done kind of a thing where you're in ambassadors and then,
Yeah.
maybe we'll see you around campus. And
Yeah.
what has been on my heart and Mika's heart is staying connected, that network.
Yeah.
I'll give a little bit of a long-winded context. Finally, we have a Mosaic affinity group organization that is only a couple years old now. That's part of our networking for ambassadors, but not just ambassadors, it's across Azusa Pacific for faculty members, staff members, administrators of color to come together to have a voice. Now I'm thinking about ambassadors, diversity ambassadors, like yourself. How might we cultivate those alums? How might we provide this type of interaction so that we can say, we continue to value you? It wasn't just when you were in our cohort for 6 sessions, right?
Yeah.
And I know people get busy, but how can we create an alumni network of ambassadors? I'm just curious. I'm throwing that idea out there, but I know you might have some insights.
Well, I love, love that you started the masterclass series, because that has been that even one session. And again, we're talking about names, so I want to get it right, with Dr. Jade Chia. Yeah, okay. That would be terrible to go through this whole thing on names and think I mispronounced it. But Dr. Jade Chia, that was the cultural intelligence session. I mean, I love that it was it was a 1 day, kind of 2 hour, thing that we had. So it was very manageable in terms of a schedule, but I really appreciated the ongoing resources that you have provided after, I think I finished diversity ambassador program in like fall of 2020. So it's been, a while now, but I just thought that was such an innovative way, but also it felt very continual, right? So it wasn't just like you're done and we're going to add this great new concept into the current diversity ambassador program, but it was something that was offered to us that have, are still looking for that ongoing resource. And so just the master's classes that you've been providing, I think that, and it was really great to meet other diversity ambassadors who were not in the session that I was in, right? Like you recognize someone, you go, oh, I didn't know you did. When did you do it? Oh, in 2019. And, so it created this sort of synergy that I value being part of a team. And so I loved that opportunity to connect again and be able to learn something that was really important that I've already started implementing in some of my work and research, the presentation that she had. And so that's one simple way that I think I've been really grateful of what you've done in terms of, as an alumni, to still stay connected with resources, but also with people. So I really very much appreciated that.
Good. Well, I'm glad that was beneficial, and we will continue that as well. So as we begin to wrap up our little cafecito coffee time together, are there any general thoughts that you may not have shared about diversity ambassadors, or your experience in diversity ambassadors, or even how that experience may have influenced your personal or professional life?
Yeah, I just feel very grateful. I think that's that's my non-scholarly put the bow on it. No, I just feel really, really grateful that that I had the opportunity to be part of it. I feel grateful that there is an opportunity to stay connected. I feel grateful for the friendship and relationship with you and Mike. I just feel very appreciative. I think my experience as a faculty, again, being part of a department, but also teaching primarily online, sometimes you can feel a little bit isolated. You can feel a little bit lonely, right? And so I think the opportunity to be part of the larger community at APU of people who have that same shared value was such a huge impact for me. And again, as a new, even though I've been at APU for 20 something years, but as a newer full-time faculty, that opportunity to have a real applicable life application information, I think was really helpful. And I think I mentioned too with my husband and our girls, like I live this every day, wanting to learn and grow and be mindful of even the environment we're creating in our home. How are we creating a home environment that is inclusive and mindful of diversity? And so I think even being part of what you offered in that APU option, I see the transfer to what I'm able to do in my life. And so, I just feel really grateful. I feel really grateful to have been part of it and continue to be part of it, even as an alumni.
Well, we are grateful too, Angela, and thank you for joining us in our Cafecito today. Thank you for the heartfelt reflections, and thank you for sharing your expertise and love of learning in life with your students, your colleagues, your family, and those around you. So thanks for our time together, and we look forward to future Cafecitos
Thank you.
together.
I appreciate it.
God bless you.